Okay, on into Carnap's project and the project of the Vienna Circle. The first thing that I want to highlight in this project is that they adopt what is called the verification principle. Many people debated the verification principle, so I'm going to give you a lot of words that are associated with it, but basically it's a criterion for meaning. So the verification principle says an expression is meaningless unless it is verifiable. That was the initial formulation. But we realized after a point that, there are problems with the correspondence theory of truth, and verification is an incredibly high bar for any claim because you don't know that it's going to be true in the future. So there are problems stemming from Hume's concerns with induction, things like that. So as the verification principle ages through the early 20th century, it starts to become maybe more a principle of testability, or a principle of falsifiability, or a principle of corroboration. So a claim or an expression or a sentence is meaningless unless you can somehow corroborate it with empirical evidence. So I'm going to take this generally for now and say that the verification principle, very loosely construed, has an empirical connection to the world, right? So a sentence is meaningless if it doesn't map onto anything that you can see, hear, taste, touch, smell. It has to have observable consequences, or you're not talking about anything. It's meaningless. Okay, so we start with this verification principle. We're developing a meaningful language. And one of the other premises is that in order to do this, right, if we're going to have a connection to the world, then we have to have sense data. And sense data, as it's construed in this movement, is stuff that can be broken down into atomic pieces of a language and atomic experiences. So my seeings of red, my tastings of kiwi lime pie, my sensation of the floor against my feet. All of these are individual sense data. They're construed as being completely separate from one another. We have words that latch onto these pieces of sense data, and lo and behold, we develop a language. The language is compositional in that we add up all of our different expressions of our different sense experiences, of our sense data, and we put them together, and that becomes the language. So sentences derive their meaning through the components that comprise the sentence. This is great for the Vienna Circle. They really think that they're getting somewhere because they have this terrific theory of language and how it's meaningful, and this contributes to a notion of the unity of science. So notice that they're solving a lot of problems here, or at least trying to. So they're interested in showing how scientific claims are meaningful, showing that scientific method is unified and is everywhere, and that scientific method can be applied to an understanding of language. So you have this reciprocal relationship where all scientific claims are made in language. So a semantic theory is going to help us understand our scientific claims, but also if we have a science of language, it's going to follow the same rules because science is unified and uses the same method no matter where it is. So as we come to understand language better and better, we are just using scientific method. And so everything reduces down to what is observable. Notice, though, that partnered with this verification principle, with this heavy-duty empiricism, we also have kind of a conventional system. We have kind of a coherentist notion of language, right? It all hangs together. It fits together. Meaningful components are hooked together with logical operators, with prepositions, with connections in a sentence. So Carnap likens this in a famous passage to a subway system, right? So we know that the stop for downtown is the stop for downtown on the subway system because it's in the middle of all of the other stops, right? Kind of an all roads lead to Rome thing. This is he's got this notion that each stop is defined by where it is in relation to the other stops. So if you think about like the number system, this makes perfect sense because the number 5 is the number 5 because it is one more than 4 and one less than 6. And the downtown stop is downtown because it's closer to the center of the city than any other stop, right? The last stop on the North Line is the last stop because it's where the North Line ends and it's more north than any other stops. So think about subways, think about this mapping onto a mathematical system, and then apply that to a language. So expressions or words in a language have meaning because they are positioned relative to every other word, every other claim in that language. So syntax becomes extremely important. Relationships between words become extremely important. And these relationships are expressed by the logical operators. So yay for not, or, and, if then, all of our favorites, right? This is what helps us out. Notice though, that we still have this pernicious problem of sense data, right? What if I see a color and I call it blue and it is not the same color that you see? So I may use the word blue to refer to my experience of blue. You may use the word blue to refer to your experience of blue, even though it's red or purple or something else. We have this wonderful subway system map of language and all these words being interconnected and working with each other, and yet we could be completely talking past each other. And there's nothing we can do about that. That's just a problem of skepticism because everybody's sense data is private and they just sort of leave it alone and they say, who cares, language works, this is great. However, if you do bump into something in the empirical world that doesn't jive with your language, you are allowed under this semantic conventionalism under Carnap's doctrine to change your language at any time. So, hey, it's not working anymore, invent a new word, invent a new expression, ditch some old expressions. And we see this happening really in language, and I hope that you're hearing Kuhn in the background because he's definitely relevant even though he writes a little bit later, right? If we suddenly realize that we have no use for the medieval humors in the blood, throw it out, make a new language. That's okay, that's cool, that's fine. Ultimately, what this means is that we have an infinite number of interchangeable systems, or at least an infinite number of equally useful systems. And it all depends on our purposes and what's convenient for us. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. You can have as many languages as you like. You can develop them, redevelop them. Everything is great. What else? Okay. So Carnap also is the one who really fleshes out this notion of a meta language. So you define each individual language by its analytic claims. Basically, let's start with by its tautological claims, because those are the boundaries of the language. The contradictions in a language, these form the bones, the skeleton, and these define the language. Can you change the bones? Sure. But if you change the bones, you're speaking a different language. How can we talk about changing bones from language A to language B? We have a meta language in which we can talk about both of them. Notice that the meta language will also have tautologies and contradictions. It will also have boundary conditions. They may be the same as the natural language that you're speaking in, or they may be different. So you can flex around with your meta language as long as you can use it to map onto your language, you're great. All of these languages are arbitrary, so we can change our language, we can change our meta language, we can adopt whatever metaphysics we would like to talk about in our language, so we can develop a language around astrology if we want to. We can develop a language around demonic influences or possible worlds if we want to. It all depends on your purposes. And the question is it practical and does it help? So you have this wonderful set of systems that's really fleshed out by Carnap. And I know that Wittgenstein plants the seeds, but Carnap really brings it into full focus. What do we do with these languages and meta-languages? We learn that we can ask internal and external questions. So questions internal to a language are well-formed questions that have clear answers. So if I say, how do I get to the store? You tell me how I get to the store. It's a great question. It's well-formed. It has an answer, and we move forward and everything's great. An external question is a question about what is beyond our language. And so that kind of collapses into metaphysics and ontology. And remember, we're not doing any ontology. So you've got external questions. Those are things that are ultimately unanswerable or questions that we would have to develop a new meta-language in order to answer. We need to dismiss external questions and stick to internal questions, and that's how we know that we will be doing good science. So our language really does construct our world, a la Wittgenstein. So we don't talk about divinities and goodness and love and abstract perfection, blah, 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 unless we want to. If we stipulate that that's the purpose of the language, we can do that. Now, the Vienna Circle also tends to adopt what is called methodological naturalism. And this is the idea, right, kind of following Occam's razor, that we don't want to multiply metaphysical entities, and that what we'd like to do is say that science, right, naturalism, physics, can explain everything in the world, just because it's simpler, just because this seems to be how science proceeds. So it functions to unify science and to keep things simple. So they tend to work with this. They like this. It fits with the notion of sense data and empiricism as the ground for language. But of course, let a thousand flowers bloom. We're not strapped to this. This is just something that we prefer for our convenience. So you've got this fantastic system developed by the Vienna Circle. I still think that it's very solid in many ways, explains a lot of the features of language, but of course, all doctrines have their criticisms. The big criticism of the Vienna Circle notion of semantic conventionalism is this fundamental question of the verification principle. Unfortunately, the verification principle is not itself verifiable, and so in the long tradition of empiricists, as you recall, Hume also burned his book because he realized that even though he was siding with empiricism, he could not use empiricism to show that any of his claims were true, so he burns his book and goes to the bar. Wittgenstein has done the same thing in the Tractatus, right? One must realize upon understanding these statements that you must throw the ladder away, rise up above it. And once again, at the end of this movement of the Vienna Circle, we throw the ladder away. This wonderful structure, this Aufbau, all of this theory of language, this is something that cannot be verified. It is all abstract, it is all metaphysical, right? It is the metaphysics of language construction and language structure. And so yet again, we throw the ladder away. There's a systematic and fundamental problem with this notion of semantic conventionalism. Just as a quick note, I tend to disagree. I think that you can just climb up into a meta language and escape, but I'll leave that for you to decide. And again, I'm going to scroll through, and the next set will be about Quine.